In the last few weeks, we've been talking about that real relationships are hard. There's a challenge to them. But last week, we talked about that real relationships are scandalous. That when we were really loving people and doing what we're supposed to be doing, that they're just absolutely scandalous. They're difficult. They're challenging. And marriage is really hard. We've admitted that. It's even harder if it's a second marriage. As a church, we always pray for redemption. We want redemption. That's what we pray for. But sometimes that just doesn't happen. Different reasons, different things happen. And we've met with many people that are single again, that had no desire to be single again. That wasn't the goal. They never decided one day that that's what was going to happen. And they don't want to be identified. They don't want folks to look at them and say, well, that's the divorced woman or man, or that's the single mom, that's the cheated on, that's the cheater. That's not what they want to be identified as. They don't want to be looked at like this. But remarriage and second marriages and third marriages are hard. They're challenging. And first marriages are hard by themselves. And we've talked about that. And there's some quotes I wanted to share with you this morning about marriage. And so this first one is, if you are in my age bracket and you're a child of the 80s, then you understand how hard it is to get this name correct. And it's Socrates, but I so want to call it Socrates. And philosophize, but that's not the quote. But here's the quote. So you've seen the movie. It says, "By all means marry. And if you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad one, you'll become a philosopher." An anonymous quote. "Being married is like having a best friend who doesn't remember anything you say." Dr. Seuss said this: "We're all a little weird, and life's a little weird. And when we find someone whose weirdness is compatible with ours, we join up with them. We fall in mutual weirdness, and we call it love." That's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. There are multiple stories of blended families all through Scripture. Multiple stories. We can go from the Old Testament to the New. And probably what's pretty scandalous in our faith, what separates Christianity, is the birth of Christ comes to an unwed, high school-aged mom. And for Jesus, I think this may have been part of the actual plan. For Jesus to be able to say, "I know how you feel. I know exactly how you feel." I mean, if you've been married previously and you've been thinking about getting married again, you understand that there's this engagement thing. And for Mary and Joseph, they were betrothed. And that has a little steeper meaning than just engaged. You know, for some, you have the time where you're dating, and maybe you did the promise ring thing. Maybe you did that, and then there was an engagement, and then there was wedding. And in this time period, there would have been the time when they would have acknowledged who they were going to marry, and maybe the deal was set up between dads or families. Maybe it was to secure peace. But there was a time when the engagement would begin, and then it would take a next step. It would step up the intensity, and it would become betrothed. And by all legal definitions, you are married. The one that separates it was you were not sharing a home, you were not sharing a bed, there was no sexual relations. This was all about, this is what the community would know, that all the other guys would know, this is not a family you could even begin that request, because basically she's married if she's betrothed. And so it was just to ratchet it up. And betrothed, it's a foreign word for us today. We don't really use it. It's not culturally acceptable. It's not something we're in on. But to end a betrothment, you would have had to have a legal document. You would have had to go before somebody and end this relationship, just like a divorce would have been in a married relationship. So it's during this betrothal when Mary goes to Joseph and says to him, I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant. Now, I can imagine, if you're Joseph and you understand that you're gearing up for your wedding day, your wedding night with your future bride, and he's got to be thinking, that's not mine. That's not mine. And if it's not mine, and I know it's not mine, then whose is it? And I'm sure that Joseph would have had some real questions here. I mean, he had an opportunity. In fact, it says in Scripture that he considered leaving her and divorcing her, but he wanted to do it privately. He wanted to save face, not just for himself, but for Mary. He didn't want her to be embarrassed, and she's telling him this unbelievable story. Can you imagine that if you were engaged and your bride comes to you and says, I'm pregnant. I know it's not yours, but this angel came. I mean, that has he's like, what have you been smoking? Are you serious? But whatever was inside of Joseph to say, I believe you. I believe you. Because if you're if you're one of Joe's friends, what are you doing? Dump her. Get out. Run like the wind. Because this girl's not right. Not only is she pregnant with somebody else's child, she's crazy. Nobody wants to marry crazy. No, nobody should marry crazy. Some of you are a little glassy-eyed when you see crazy and you think, well, there's hope, but there's not. Crazy's crazy. And he's looking at this, and he's got to make some tough decisions. And I'm sure if Joseph's friends are telling him, get out. I can't imagine the pressure he would have felt. And if you got to think back to this time period, there would have been huge implications. There would have been huge implications about this. There would have been betrayal. There would have been embarrassment, but he stood by her. And there's just something in him that he knew and he believed against all odds that she was telling the truth. And people are cruel. People are cruel. They say things, even though it's true and obvious, doesn't mean we always have to say it. We just don't always have to say it. But the crowd, there's a time in Jesus' ministry where the crowd comes and they don't challenge necessarily that he is the Son of God. They don't challenge that. They attack where he came from. And you'll know what I mean. I mean, in Jesus, when he begins his ministry, there's no mention of Joseph. Joseph is gone. It's safe to say he had passed. In that culture, that time period, husbands would have taken younger wives. It's not unusual, and men do not live as long as women. And there's no mention of Joseph. There's mention of siblings. There's mention of other children, but there is no mention of Joe. And so you would begin to believe that he probably had passed. He was not identified in this passage as Joseph's son. He was identified as Mary's son. And in this time, in this culture, this would have been absolutely insulting. In Mark chapter 6, verse 3 through 4, this is what it says. The crowd is questioning Jesus. And they say, isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? The brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. They took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. So what the crowd was saying to him, aren't you Mary's boy? This was not an opportunity to say, Joseph has passed. This is Mary. Joseph's not around. What they were saying is, you're part of that unwed mother. We remember. And see, kids would have grown up. This would have been people Jesus' age, maybe a little older. So it's not that they came to this conclusion on their own. They heard mom and dad talking at the table. When they were breaking bread, they would have said that Jesus, that kid you're playing with at recess, mom and dad never got married. Wow. He's a stepson. They would have had some type of phrase. They would have identified Jesus. So when he's talking in his hometown, it wouldn't have been Jesus who this miraculous angel comes and talks to Mary, and Joseph does this unbelievable, honorable thing and brings him into his home. It was, isn't this Mary's boy? And aren't you just a carpenter? Aren't you just a carpenter? Mary's boy. It would have been a disgrace. Now, Ron Deal is considered by many to be the forefront in blending families and speaking and writing and author. And he's the founder and president of Smart Step Families. And he's the director of the Family Life Blended. And he's got this quote I want to share with you. It said, couples should be highly educated about remarriage and the process of becoming a step family before they ever walk down the aisle. Remarriage, particularly when children are involved, is much more challenging than dating seems to imply. Be sure to open your eyes well before a decision to marry has been made. And he has his books and articles, and people can tend to think that he's an authority on this. And he wrote the following, which was just things to consider, kind of his top 10 list that couples should really think through. Now, if this data is correct, that remarriage is prevalent in our community, remarriage is prevalent in our church. That either the odds are, either you are remarried, or a parent has been remarried, or your spouse's parents have been remarried. It would be unbelievably odd for somebody in this room to say, me and my wife and their parents are all first-time marriages. The odds are against it. So when we're talking about remarriage, you may be thinking, this does not apply to me. It most certainly does. And if you've had children, if you have children, and they're getting to that point where they're thinking about marriage, this applies to them too. And so this is the things he said that are kind of the top 10 challenges or things that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about remarriage. And this is some of the things he says. The first one, you need to wait 2 to 3 years following a divorce or the death of your spouse before seriously dating. He says it just takes time to heal. It takes time for your children to heal. Moving on in a relationship short circuits the healing process. He would argue that it slows down the healing process if you jump back in a relationship too quickly. That what we do is when we should be healing is that we just mask it and we put it to the back because now it's not the number one priority. We just jump right in. And then when we get into a new relationship, we become invested in it. So we start spending energy there and we stop healing. And he says, you have to grieve. You have to grieve. Your children have to grieve. They have to have time to process what is really happening. Second thing he says is when you're dating 2 years before deciding to marry, then date your future spouse's children before the wedding. He says some pretty strong things in this point. He says that falling in love is not enough. Falling in love is just not enough. He says remarriage is just so hard. It takes time. And your children, that once the decision is made to remarry, that you have to really invest to invest in the building that bond with your children and with your spouse's potential children. It just takes energy and it takes time and it has to become really important in what you're doing. The third one is, he says this, you got to know how to cook a step family. He says for some, you like to use pressure cookers, you look to use high heat, you just want to use a microwave and turn it on and do it really fast. He said, but what you have to do with a step family is you have to cook it in a crock pot. Low heat, and it takes time. That crock pot cooking is great because it gives it time to blend well, and it just takes time. And see, for so many of us, we are wrapped into our identity of marriage that we are still banking on the fact that our spouse is going to redeem us and make us whole for past garbage they may not even know about. So when that spouse passes or is divorced, or we divorce, then all of a sudden we're single, then we are clinging for the next hope of redemption, so we jump right in. And what Dr. Deal is saying is you got to stop and slow down. It's a crock pot. Fourth one is realize that the honeymoon comes at the end of the journey for remarried couples, not the beginning. Blended families that cook properly will bring real joy at the end of the process, not at the beginning. It's like we are paying the price up front, not on the back end. Because when we really invest in our families and we're trying to blend them, it takes energy, and there's also the potential for rejection. We mess up, we do things wrong, we say the wrong things, we learn the quirks, we learn all those things, and we got to do that on the front side. Fifth thing he says is you got to think about the kids. If there are kids involved, you have to think about them. Because when we remarry, then what we are doing is we are ending the dreams of reconciliation. Kids go to bed at night, no matter how bad that marriage may have been and how many fights they may have witnessed, that when they go to bed at night, there's still hope that the next day that mom and dad could get back together. Now, you and your spouse may fully understand that it's never going to happen. You've crossed too many bridges. But for kids, they believe there's hope. And even if there's a death, there's still a possibility, and we cling to it that maybe there's a resurrection. Maybe there's something that's going to take place. So when we bring a new spouse, a potential new spouse into the mix, it's hard for kids because they realize hope is gone. Number 6 is we have to manage to be sensitive to loyalties. Even in the best circumstances, even in the absolute best circumstances, we don't want to pit children to feel like that means they can't like their mom or their dad. And they feel guilty if they begin to like what would be the step-parent. Because am I being disloyal to mom? Am I being disloyal to dad? So we have to be sensitive to that. We have to talk about it. We have to share with them it's okay to like the new girlfriend or the new boyfriend. And it is great that you like your mom or dad's new boyfriend or girlfriend. Give them permission to love and respect. Number 7, don't expect your new spouse to feel the same way about your children as you do. And at first I thought that meant that they can't love them like you love them. But when you dig a little deeper into that, what that's talking about is when you've had your children from birth till now, then you've got history with them on how they respond. You know all of your kids' quirks. You know how they respond in situations. A potential new spouse they're not going to have the history you have. So you can't expect them to be exactly where you are at that time. Number 8, we got to realize that remarriage has unique barriers. We got to realize there are some unique barriers in it. To be the best for your kids, you have to have the best marriage possible. You have to invest in that, and your kids have to understand that your new spouse is number one. Besides your relationship with Christ, it's now number one. It doesn't mean your kids are at the background. It just means for you really to be the parents that you were actually called to be now, that the marriage has to take precedent, has to be one. And the second part of that is that kind of that ghost of marriage past. Kind of that ghost of marriage past. So your new spouse can't pay for the price, can't pay the price for mistakes in previous marriages. They have to have grace. Number 9, parent as a team. Get your plan together. Learn to lead together, sharing authority and power. It's not just ours. It is ours. It's not just yours and mine. And number 10 is know what to tell the kids. Come up with your statements, your battle lines, the company line of what we believe, and here's how we're going to communicate and talk with them. Blending families takes patience. It takes patience. It takes love. It takes time. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, it says this: be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Through the bond of peace. That verse is a great verse to take into a remarriage. Now, I've asked a couple in our church that has blended their family. If you've been around the blended couples that started meeting about a year ago, then I'm sure you know Rick and Carrie Carlson. And if you have not had the opportunity to meet them, then I encourage you today to make sure you stop them in between services and say hi. Now, I got to tell you a little funny that I approached them weeks ago about this, and I just found out this morning that Carrie was under the impression that she was going to come and share to a small group. And it wasn't until Rick said, no. He said the church. And she's like, no, small group. So she's not nervous at all. So don't make any faces. And so I'm going to ask the Carlsons if they would to just kind of make their way up. I've asked them to come up and to help us this morning. And yeah, you can welcome them. That will help not make her nervous. And you can see a picture of the Carlson tribe up there and, who they are. And So I've asked them to come and just share a little bit about what it means in this blended family relationship. And so, how did you guys meet?
Yeah, actually, Carrie and I went to high school together. We graduated from Boone Grove High School, locally here.
Go Wolves.
Go Wolves.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Briefly dated in high school when we were 16. There's a little bit of a debate between us of why we didn't continue dating, but it's high school and that's being 16. So after high school, like many, just went our separate ways. Each of us had gotten married, had kids. Carrie had 3 boys, Carl, Grant, and Blake. And then I had a little girl, Marissa. So after a few years, our marriages were not working out. Both marriages were ending, and we were actually put back in touch with each other through a mutual friend from high school, and began to date. At the time, the boys were roughly about 11, 9, and 6, I'd say, and Rissa was about a year and a half. We dated for just a little under 4 years, actually, kind of along your points, taking our time and taking it easy with the kids and sort of blending all that. And then we got married about a little over 11 years ago. And after getting married, we had our own little girl, Grace. So we've got the 3 boys from here, Rissa from here, and our little girl, Grace, together.
All right. So when did you know? When did you know this was going to happen?
I think he knew before I did. I thought he was going to bail once he realized what it takes to have 3 boys in your house. I just thought, going back, when you're dating, it's not reality. And I just thought once the reality set in, he was going to be like, yeah, this is way more than I anticipated.
Well, just feeding them alone.
Yeah, there was that part, because it's a never-ending pit.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, but for me, I knew when he stuck around. Like when things got a little dicey with boys becoming teenagers and the challenges that come along with that, he still stuck around. So I was like, oh, maybe I should believe him when he says that he's in.
I knew very early on, actually. For whatever reason, I knew right away that it was just something that I just fell in love with. And I fell in love with Carrie, but then fell in love with the boys also. There was just an instant, like I could see this working. I could see us together this. And I saw how much she loved Marissa. And I think taking our time over the 4 years, we were kind of just looking at it as this is something that we both want, something we both could see working out. It's just a matter of, how we're going to approach, how we're going to do it. But for me, it was pretty much very, very early on. I knew that this is something we can make work.
All right, so what would you guys say was the biggest hurdle in the dating phase?
You had a good one about, what did we just talk about? I can't even remember.
Well, I do know, for one thing, for blended families, it's time and scheduling and kids and activities and all that, it's difficult. Whether it's holidays, birthdays, kids' events, things like that. You always want things to be perfect. I think every parent wants to sit there around the Christmas tree and look at all their kids enjoying Christmas and that. But when you have blended families, divorced families, that's not always going to work out. They have a whole other side of a family, and they have aunts and uncles and cousins there that they love, and you need to be very aware of that and very open to what they want too. So we were very much on the same page that we weren't going to focus so much on the event and the time. We weren't going to be like, this is the way we want things and how they should be. We just knew rather than worrying so much about that moment, we're just going to create our own moments. And sometimes that meant celebrating a birthday on a different day, maybe a whole weekend later. But we knew that if we didn't make them worry about the time and the stress of when it was, that no matter what, it was just going to be a special moment for us. And I think together, us both being open to the other side's scheduling and issues made us fall in love with each other even more and helped us in our marriage, that we're both willing to give for the other that way.
I think we never wanted the kids, it's not their fault. It's not their fault that they're having to share their birthday with potentially, sometimes 3 different, between grandparents and the other household and our household. So we never wanted them to feel the stress of trying to work out a time. Like, we'll figure it out. You know, you can create a moment anytime. It doesn't have to be on that specific day.
Good. So you're just trying to keep the stress away was a hurdle. Okay. All right. So now that you've been married 11 years, right? 11 years. Okay. And so what's the biggest hurdle now that you're 11 years in? There was children on both sides, and you have a child together. So what's the biggest hurdle now?
I'd say the biggest hurdle is Carrie's wondering why there's not grandkids yet.
I really want a grandkid. I'm not rushing anyone.
Yeah.
My son is in the audience. I'm not rushing. I miss having a baby around.
Okay.
But no, I think it's still the same thing in all seriousness. I really do. I think it's still time now that the boys are adults, you know, and they've got girlfriends and important jobs, and, you know, you don't always get a vacation time at the same time, all of that. I think it's still the same thing, just trying to have time together when we're all together at the same time is few and far between sometimes. So sometimes if one person can't come, well, that's okay. We're still going to go do this and not feel bad about it.
I think being divorced, too, one of the hurdles is it messes with your head sometimes. You know, you have this feeling sometimes like you failed, you know, or you let people down. You have guilt because there's kids involved, and you wonder how you've altered to change their lives. You know, you hope for the better sometimes, but not always. But I do know that sometimes you drag that into, you know, your new marriage, and whatever struggles you have or frustrations or aggravations you have, you kind of take that out sometimes on each other. But being aware of her situation, her being aware of mine, and us working on that together, I think kind of limits that hurdle and keeps that from boiling over into making more issues.
And I think you alluded to it on one of the points when you're looking to marrying someone with children. Loving each other isn't enough. You have to fall in love with their children. And we, in the short amount of time that this has become kind of a ministry for us that we so did not see coming, there's a lot of animosity that I was shocked to see the other parent with those children, because we just didn't deal with that. So we were very blessed that we both love kids, and the more the merrier. So that wasn't really a struggle for us. But I do see a lot of step families or just blended families dealing with that, and that's just not going to work.
Right. All right. So what would you say is the most beneficial thing that happened in your new relationship when you guys started and got going? What's the one thing that happened that really set it apart?
I guess this ties in what Carrie was just talking about. From the very start, we both knew that when we fell in love with each other, we fell in love with the kids also. And when I fell in love with Carrie, I fell in love with the boys. That was just something that wasn't even questioned. And in my personal opinion, I mean, everybody can handle their situation the way they want, but my personal opinion is I'm not a big fan of the step label. I know it has to be used, and I know it's common, but I've never been a fan of having to label kids differently from other kids in a family in that. You'll never hear me say stepson. I've just kind of always called them my boys. And to me, they've always been my boys. I haven't had any kind of disconnect from them as far as how we raise them and how our family is. And I think being that upfront and honest and open about them as my boys, and seeing that in Carrie with Marissa, her girl, you know, that grows our relationship even stronger and our marriage even stronger. And I was telling Sean a story one time. I had worked with these guys for 3 or 4 years, and we all knew each other pretty well. And like typical guys at work, you tell stories Monday about what you've done the weekend with your kids and your family. And I would be like, oh, you know, my boy Grant and I are working on his car in the garage or something like that, or my boy Blake wants to go to college at VU and such, you know. And I started telling a story. I said, well, my boy Carl got a new job, and I just started rambling on. And this one guy, like I said, we worked together 3 or 4 years. He's just kind of looking at me. He says, I got to ask you this, and I've been wanting to ask you for a long time, but did you seriously name your kid Carl Carlson? Because that's a real jerk move, you know. And I was kind of looking at him. I said, oh, no, okay. And I had to explain the situation and whatever. And it wasn't so much that I didn't make an effort to not explain our family dynamic. It wasn't that. because it's part of our story. But to me, it wasn't the overwhelming part of our story. The overwhelming part of our story is we have this family, and we love each other, and we've raised these kids together, and, you know, we hold these kids as our own together. And, you know, calling them my boys in there, that is never to take away from their father or their relationship with their father. I've encouraged that as much as I can, and I think that's a really good thing for them to have that relationship on that side. But I always wanted them to know how much they meant to me as far as being my boys and not my stepsons.
All right, so last question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to share with anybody that's working through a remarriage or potentially getting remarried, what's the one thing you would share?
I think the advice I would give them is the same advice I would give my adult children is slow down. Just slow down. It's not just about you anymore. Once you bring these other people into the world, you kind of lose the right to be selfish, and take your time. You know, take your time. Breathe. Yeah. Nobody wants to be lonely. I mean, we talked about that before this, and that's the hardest part. Yeah. Is rushing into something else just because you don't want to be alone.
And I think especially if there's kids involved, if you're taking it slow and not rushing them to anything, I think they see maybe how important it is to you and how seriously you're taking, as opposed to, oh, you know, guess what we're doing this weekend? We're getting married again. And it's an opportunity for them to get married with you also, to grow and to kind of accept what's going on and what the changes are without taking away from everything else they have on the other side of their family.
Very cool, very cool. Well, today we wanted just to talk about things that I don't know that we always talk about in church. And we wanted to carve this out in real relationships, because this is happening. It's happening in this room. It's happening in our community. It's happening in our families. And so we need to identify it. We need to talk about it and be a part of this. And so I appreciate Rick and Carrie to come up and to share and to be open. Yeah. So if you'd stand with me, I want to close this today. Maybe there's somebody in your mind. Maybe there's a spouse. Maybe there's a future spouse. Maybe there's somebody in your family that you know that they're in the verge of mixing and blending. Maybe there's somebody you just need to specifically pray for. And so today, let's pray for them, okay?